Welcome to the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. If you want effective and actionable tips to simplify the overwhelm of launching and managing your podcast, then this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Verity Songon, podcast manager, launch strategist, and host of a Top 100 podcast. I'm really excited to have you here, so without further ado, let's dive into the episode. Hello there and welcome back to another episode of the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about episode titles and the great debate of should you include episode numbers in your episode titles. As I said, it does seem to be one of the biggest debates in the podcasting world as to whether or not you include episode numbers in your podcast titles. On the one hand, you've got some that argue that it helps listeners keep track of what they've listened to and what they haven't, while others argue that it clutters up the title and can be confusing for new listeners. In fact, one quick Google of the question, should I include episode numbers in my podcast title, gives a lot of opinions that come down very hard on one side of the debate or the other. And so for this episode, I wanted to explore the pros and cons of including episode numbers in your podcast titles in order to help you make an informed decision that aligns your goals or with your goals and your target audience. So let's jump in. First of all, the pros of including episode numbers in your podcast titles. Some or many podcasters absolutely swear by including episode numbers in their podcast titles. So first of all, it helps listeners keep track of episodes. This is probably one of the most significant benefits of including episode numbers in your podcast titles because, as I said, it helps listeners keep track of the episodes that they have listened to. When podcast titles include episode numbers, it's really easy for your listeners to identify which episode they're currently listening to and which ones they've already listened to, and can be particularly helpful for listeners who are catching up on or binging a new one. It's remembering as well that in 2023, we are very time poor and we want everything given to us as quickly as possible. So if you can scroll to an easily identifiable numbered episode, this is a lot easier than searching for a title, which could be quite similar to that of another episode title. The second pro is it adds a sense of continuity. So including episode numbers in your podcast titles can add that sense of continuity to your show. They can help listeners understand the order in which your episodes were released and can provide context for ongoing discussions or storylines. And this continuity can help build a loyal fan base and keep listeners engaged over time. The cons of including episode numbers, though, the first one is that it can make your episode titles too long or very long. Remembering that including episode numbers in podcast titles can make them unnecessarily long, which can be a real turn-off for listeners. Long titles can be difficult to read and may not be displayed properly, particularly on smaller screens. And this is really important when we consider that the vast majority of podcast listeners do listen on small screens, i.e. a smartphone. Additionally, long titles can make it challenging to fit in additional information such as guest names or topics covered in the episode and fitting it all in so that somebody scrolling through your podcast titles and selecting an episode can get all the information they need to make an informed choice as to what they want to listen to. Also, it might not be necessary for all podcasts. Including episode numbers in podcast titles, for example, if your podcast is more of a talk show format, including episode numbers may not be relevant. Similarly, if your podcast is more thematic and not necessarily chronological, including episode numbers may not add value to your titles. So listener preferences when it comes to episode numbers in your podcast titles. Ultimately, whether or not to include episode numbers in your podcast titles depends on listener preferences. Some listeners prefer to see episode numbers in titles, whilst others find them unnecessary or even confusing. And it's important to consider your target audience and what they are looking for in a podcast title. One way to gauge listener preferences is to conduct a survey or a poll among your current listeners, and this can help you understand whether or not to include episode numbers in your titles and whether or not it's important to them. You can also look at other podcasts in your genre to see if they include episode numbers in their titles and how listeners respond to this additional information. So tips on creating effective podcast titles. Whether or not you decide to include episode numbers in your podcast titles, it's essential to create titles that are engaging, memorable, and relevant to your target audience. So here are my top tips on creating effective podcast titles. Number 1, keep it short and sweet. As mentioned earlier, long titles can be a real turn-off for listeners. Keep your titles short, sweet, and easy to skim read when your listener is choosing an episode to listen to. Number 2, make it memorable. A memorable title can help your podcast really stand out from the crowd, so consider using puns, alliteration, or other creative techniques to make your titles more memorable. Number 3, reflect the content of the episode. Your podcast title should accurately reflect the content of your episode, so avoid misleading titles that don't accurately represent what listeners can expect to hear in the episode. On this note, it's okay to include the name of a guest in your title, if you've got a guest that is, but don't just call the episode by the guest's name. Why? Because this doesn't tell the listener what the episode is all about. For example, if I interviewed John Bon Jovi for my podcast, because, we can all wish, can't we? Titling the episode John Bon Jovi doesn't mean very much. Did we talk about his career in music? Did we talk about his political opinions, his charity work? What would make sense is having a title that tells the audience what they are listening to and who with. So, for example, looking back on a career in music with John Bon Jovi, it tells you what to expect from the episode plus who's interviewed as well. Tip 4, use keywords. Using keywords in your podcast titles can help improve search engine optimization or SEO and make it easier for listeners to find your episodes. Use relevant keywords that accurately reflect the content of the episode. The keyword, no pun intended, here is relevant. Don't keyword stuff to try and rank higher, as this can make your work confusing to listeners. Write naturally whilst including the keywords, because the algorithms will get what your episode is about. Remember, algorithms are ridiculously intelligent these days. So, some advice for using episode numbers in your podcast titles. If you do decide to go down the route of numbering your episode titles, here are some practices to consider. Don't go with the approach of writing the actual word episode, so episode 457 and then the title of your episode, because you're clogging up valuable space on a sometimes small screen and potentially losing the actual title to your listener. Don't exchange the word episode for an acronym of your podcast name, because that's just confusing and it doesn't really mean much to anybody. The importance of consistency in podcast titles. Consistency is key when it comes to podcast titles, because whether or not you include episode numbers, it's important to keep your titles consistent from episode to episode. This consistency can help build brand recognition and make it easier for listeners to find and identify your podcast. So to round up there, deciding whether or not to include episode numbers in your podcast titles can be challenging, and to make an informed decision, make sure you are considering the following factors. First of all, your target audience. Consider your target audience and what they're looking for in a podcast title. If your audience values continuity and keeping track of episodes, including episode numbers may be beneficial. 2, your podcast format. Consider your podcast format and whether or not episode numbers are relevant. If your podcast is more thematic and doesn't follow a chronological format, including episode numbers may not add value. Number 3, listener preferences. Finally, if you are really stuck in deciding to include numbers in your podcast titles, consider listener preferences and conduct a survey or poll to gauge your listeners' opinions on including episode numbers in your titles. So as we have looked at in this episode, including episode numbers in podcast titles has got both pros and cons. Whilst it can help keep track of episodes, it can make titles long and be confusing for new listeners. You've probably already noticed that this is something that I just don't bother with either of my podcasts, either The Confident CEO or this podcast, The Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. And this is a completely personal decision because I prefer to go with a title only and no numbers. But as my back catalogue grows, who knows, maybe I will be a convert to adding episode numbers into my episode titles. But ultimately, the decision to include episode numbers in your titles should be based on your target audience, podcast format, and listener preferences. But most importantly, by creating engaging and consistent episode titles, you can build a loyal listener base and stand out in the crowded podcasting landscape. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. If you loved this episode, I think you'll love being on my email newsletter list, where I send out weekly podcasting tips to help you create, host and grow a podcast that you love. To join, go to veritysongcon.com/newsletter or hit the link in the show notes. Until next time, happy podcasting.